There is something deeply wrong with the bread on your table. In our convent stillroom book, the handwritten record kept by the sisters who ran our kitchen and infirmary long before I arrived, there is an entry from 1219 in the hill country outside Assisi. It notes, in careful ink, that every soul nursed in the infirmary that winter received 1.5 pounds of dark barley and spelt bread each day. The very same grains named nearly 2,000 years earlier in the book of Ezekiel, wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt, baked together into one loaf. It was not a delicacy, it was medicine, and everyone knew it. Scripture called bread the staff of life. It fed Elijah in the wilderness. It sustained the Israelites for 40 years as manna. It appears at nearly every meal that mattered, from the Passover table to the Last Supper itself. But today, that same word bread describes something that inflames your gut, spikes your blood sugar, and leaves you hungry again within the hour. Something has gone very wrong between Ezekiel's bread and yours, and I don't think it's your body's fault. Before we go further, dear one, leave a comment and tell me, have you ever felt unwell after eating bread? Bloating? Fatigue? A heaviness that won't lift? Let me know below, because what I'm about to show you may change how you see every loaf on the shelf. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd be glad to have you with us. Now let us go into the kitchen. Pick up a loaf of supermarket bread and read the ingredients. Enriched wheat flour, code for wheat stripped of nearly everything valuable, then dosed with synthetic vitamins to meet a legal minimum. High fructose corn syrup, soybean oil, mono and diglycerides. Dough conditioners with names that belong in a chemistry lab, not a kitchen. The bread named in Scripture had, at most, 4 ingredients: flour, water, salt, and a little leaven. Ezekiel's loaf added a handful of grains and legumes, ground together, nothing more elaborate than that. Modern industrial bread needs 20 to 30 ingredients just to survive 2 weeks on a shelf. The wheat itself has changed too, and this is where it gets serious. In 1960, a scientist named Norman Borlaug developed what became known as miracle wheat, short-stalked, high-yield, resistant to disease. It fed millions and rightly earned him a Nobel Prize. But it was bred for one thing above all others: yield per acre. Not digestibility, not nutrition. To achieve that yield, breeders reshaped the plant's gluten structure and pushed its chromosome count from the 14 of ancient einkorn to the 28 of emmer, the wheat that fed the builders of the pyramids, to the 42 of the wheat in your bread today. That genetic complexity came at a cost. Modern wheat carries gluten proteins your great-grandparents' bodies never encountered, and research out of the University of Kansas has found that this modern gluten triggers a noticeably stronger immune response than the older varieties do. Then there's the milling. Grain in the ancient and medieval world was ground slowly between stones, keeping the bran, germ, and endosperm together: fiber, healthy fats, B vitamins, minerals, all intact. Modern roller milling, introduced in the 1870s, strips the bran and germ away entirely because their natural oils spoil too quickly for a long shelf life. What remains is nearly pure starch, then bleached whiter still with chemical agents. This is what gets sold back to you as enriched, because they must add back a fraction of what they removed. And then there's time, or rather the lack of it. Scriptural and medieval bread alike rested and fermented for 12 to 24 hours before baking. That slow fermentation pre-digested the loaf, breaking down starches, neutralizing phytic acid, reducing the lectins that irritate the gut lining. Your modern loaf is mixed, risen, and baked in under 3 hours. No fermentation, no breakdown, just raw, reactive protein hitting your gut at full strength. The result is a food that looks like bread and smells like bread, but behaves in your body closer to sugar. White bread carries a higher glycemic index than a spoonful of table sugar itself. To understand what changed, dear one, we have to go back to how sisters like the ones before me actually kept a kitchen. Convents across the Mediterranean and the Near East preserved what farmers there had grown since Scripture was first written, landrace grains, adapted over centuries to their own soil and climate, rather than bread for uniform yield. Einkorn, the oldest cultivated wheat, dating back some 10,000 years. Emmer, the grain of Egypt, the same fields the Israelites would have known well. Spelt, favored across monastic Europe for generations. These grains varied field to field, which made them resilient and, we now understand, remarkably gentle on digestion. Einkorn's gluten is structurally simple and weak, which is precisely why it doesn't rise as dramatically as modern bread, and precisely why it's easier on the body. Researchers at the University of Florence found that people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity could eat einkorn bread without triggering symptoms. Its gliadin proteins are shaped differently. The immune system simply doesn't recognize them as a threat. Einkorn also carries roughly 30% more protein than modern wheat, along with far higher levels of beta-carotene and lutein antioxidants that protect the eyes and brain. Convent mills, like most of that era, were turned slowly by water or wind, generating almost no heat, which preserved the delicate oils in the wheat germ oils, rich in vitamin E, and the same beneficial fats now recommended for heart health. And the real secret, the one I still practice in our own kitchen, was the starter. No convent kept commercial yeast. Instead, wild yeast and bacteria were captured from the air and kept alive in a mother culture, fed and passed down in some houses quite literally for generations. When mixed into dough, that living culture produced lactic and acetic acid, breaking down phytic acid and neutralizing lectins long before the loaf ever reached the oven. A sister eating 2 pounds of that bread a day wasn't simply filling her stomach. She was receiving complete nourishment her body could actually use. Let's speak plainly about gluten, because this is where the real trouble begins. Gluten is not one thing. It's a family of proteins, chiefly glutenins and gliadins, that give dough its stretch and help it rise. In ancient grain like einkorn, that structure is simple and weak. In modern wheat, it is complex and strong, which is exactly why modern bread rises so high and stays soft so long, and exactly why your gut struggles to break it down. Research, published in the Journal of Proteome Research, identified gliadin fragments unique to modern wheat, including one called the 33-mer that resist digestive enzymes almost entirely. They pass through the stomach and small intestine, largely intact, and in many people, that triggers a real immune response. Then there's the chemical load. Modern wheat is treated with herbicides and fungicides throughout its growing cycle, and one practice in particular deserves your attention: pre-harvest desiccation, where fields are sprayed with glyphosate a week or two before harvest, simply to dry the crop faster. Residue from that spray has been found in a majority of non-organic wheat products tested, and the World Health Organization has classified glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. It also appears to disrupt the gut microbiome, harming the very bacteria that help you digest food and regulate immunity in the first place. Grain grown the way Scripture describes, in soil turned by hand, fed by manure and rotation, never encountered any of this. The nutritional gap that results is enormous. Heritage grains carry meaningfully more protein than modern wheat, along with higher selenium, more lutein and zeaxanthin, and considerably more omega-3s in the germ. Strip the bran and germ away, as modern milling does, and you remove the overwhelming majority of that nourishment before the loaf is even baked. In 2014, Italian researchers ran a telling experiment. They took a group of people with irritable bowel syndrome, all of whom reported real symptoms after eating ordinary bread, and switched them instead to bread made from einkorn stone-milled, slowly fermented. Roughly 80% reported meaningful improvement, less bloating, less pain, better digestion overall. The grain itself was never the problem, the processing was. A separate study from the University of Florence found that einkorn bread produced measurably lower blood glucose and insulin responses than modern bread, even eaten in identical amounts. I think of our own stillroom book often when I read findings like these. Page after page, in different hands across different generations, the same instructions repeat almost word for word: grind slowly, let the starter rest overnight, never rush the rise. One entry, from a sister who kept our infirmary in the 1800s, notes simply that the dark bread was given first to anyone recovering from a long illness because it sat easier and gave strength faster than the white. She had no laboratory. She only had generations of careful observation written down so the next sister would not have to relearn it. And today, quietly, that same knowledge is resurfacing outside convent walls too. Small bakers across Europe and North America are reviving heritage grains, stone milling their own flour, fermenting dough for a full day or more, and their customers, many of whom believed they could never eat bread again, are discovering that they can. Not because gluten was never real, but because modern wheat and modern processing created a problem that simply didn't exist before. The real break came after the Second World War. Industrialization swept through agriculture with one clear goal: feed a growing population as cheaply as possible. Hybrid wheat that yielded 3 times as much became the standard. Chemical fertilizer replaced manure and rotation. Roller mills replaced stone. Commercial yeast replaced the old mother starters, cutting a full day of fermentation down to 2 hours. It worked, in the narrowest sense. Bread became cheaper and more available than at any point in human history. But the cost was hidden, and the cost was health. Even our own convent, over the decades, largely set the old stillroom methods aside in favor of the same store-bought loaves everyone else was buying. It was faster, and no one thought much of it at the time. Rates of type 2 diabetes and autoimmune disease have climbed sharply since that shift began, and the timeline is hard to ignore. Bread was Scripture's staple food for thousands of years without any of this. The difference was never how much people ate. It was what the bread had become. When people started feeling unwell, the easy answer was to say they were sensitive, that something was wrong with them. I don't believe that, dear one. I think the body is reacting exactly as it should to a food that has quietly stopped being food. If you want bread that doesn't leave you unwell, you have a few honest paths, dear one, the same ones I would point any of the sisters toward. First, look for bakers working with heritage grain einkorn, emmer, or spelt, stone-milled and naturally fermented. They are not common, but they exist at farmers' markets and a growing number of small bakeries. Second, and this is closer to how we still do it here, keep your own starter and bake your own bread. It asks patience mixing the dough the evening before, letting it rest 12 to 24 hours, but once the rhythm settles into your week, it becomes no harder than any other regular kitchen task, and the result is bread that nourishes rather than harms. And third, in the spirit of Ezekiel's own recipe, consider setting bread aside more often in favor of the whole grains and legumes. Scripture actually named barley, lentils, spelt prepared simply without needing to become bread at all. The Still Room book taught me something I return to often. This was never about a magical, ancient bread. Grain grown carefully, milled with patience, fermented with time, and baked with real attention, that alone was enough to make it a superfood in the truest sense of that word. If you're learning something valuable here, dear one, I hope you'll subscribe. It helps us share this old knowledge with anyone who has been told their body is the problem when it was the bread that changed. Leave a comment and tell me, will you be looking for heritage grain or trying your hand at a starter of your own? I read every single one. Scripture called bread the staff of life for a reason. It was never a mystery. It was patience, honest grain, and time, the very things our Still Room book has quietly kept for longer than anyone can remember. Until next time, dear one, go gently and go well.